The Dunnhumby Network Alliance has been designed to make it easier for retailers to work together, firstly, and then to create a single home where better audiences can be built, execution of campaigns can happen across multiple retailers. And then the piece for Dunnhumby really is to try and then apply its science, insight, and measurement into that domain.
Welcome to Unlocking Retail Media, the podcast where we explore the evolving world of retail media from data strategy to monetization and everything in between. This is where we break down how retailers can build smarter, data-driven media networks by aligning with what brands truly need, from scalable ad solutions and meaningful metrics to cross-channel attribution and programmatic strategy. Welcome to Unlocking Retail Media. Today's episode is a bit different because we have to talk about something that the Kevel team helped build. Dunnhumby recently launched the Dunnhumby Network Alliance, a new way to connect retail media audiences and inventory across multiple retailers in one place. And Kevel's proud to be the technology partner behind it. My guest today is Andrew Connell, Chief Growth Officer at Dunnhumby. Andrew's been central to building this alliance from day one, and Dunnhumby just announced that Tesco, B&Q, John Lewis, Waitrose are all taking part in the early pilots. It's a big deal for the industry and the fragmentation struggle that's currently going on. We're going to get into what the alliance actually does, why Dunnhumby decided to build an open multi-retailer model instead of just scaling out one network, and what this means for brands who are tired of rebuilding their entire retail media plan 4 to 20 different times for all these different retailers and commerce media networks out there. Andrew, great to have you here. We get to work together quite a bit, but it's going to be fun to chat on the podcast about some of the work that we're doing together.
Yeah, we did loads of stuff. It's actually unusual for us to be across the video call, isn't it? So great to see you, James, and thanks for having me on your podcast.
Absolutely. So to get started, you want to give us just a little bit of your background and kind of what you're doing in Dunnhumby, and maybe just a little bit about Dunnhumby. I think I've had a number of Dunnhumby people on at this point, so I think listeners know it's always good to hear it from another person. Yeah,
so I've been at Dunnhumby only for a couple of years, so I know we have a lot of alumni around the world. I'm a newbie. My background is really, I've tried to work through both finance and telco at the intersection of where technology and platforms is changing propositions, I guess. And what I do at Dunnhumby is I lead our global media practice, if you like. And as part of that, a business that we're building with you at Kevel, with a business called the Dunnhumby Network Alliance. So really responsible for our teams that are helping bring for retailers and then some other vertical markets solutions to both accelerate retail media, but Dunnhumby's other piece is obviously things like category management and pricing for retailers, and that's the powerhouse of the sort of the data science work that we do for most of our customers.
Awesome. So yeah, let's get into the I think the news and the kind of item of the day is the Dunnhumby Network Alliance. So tell us what's the kind of goal, and what's the what are we building?
Yeah. So for anybody that doesn't know, Dunnhumby is 100% owned subsidiary of Tesco in the UK. So obviously the largest grocery in the UK. And as part of that, we do all of their data science work. One of the challenges that we see in the industry is consolidation of retail media networks. So every retailer does need to have, we believe, a network and an ability to monetize those journeys and make their customer journeys for their customers kind of meaningful. Our job is to really try and then make that much more meaningful for the brands that invest all of these dollars that we use in our retail media networks are saying that it's increasingly hard for them, because we're so fragmented as an industry, to work out who to work with or not work with. So the Dunnhumby Network Alliance has been designed to make it easier for retailers to work together, firstly, and then to create a single home where better audiences can be built, execution of campaigns can happen across multiple retailers. And then the piece for Dunnhumby really is to try and then apply its science, insight, and measurement into that domain. So actually what we're ultimately trying to do is get a much better and more efficient and powerful return on investment for those investments. So in the UK, which has been our first market, obviously we're anchored with Tesco, as you would expect, have both invested in this idea and put their foot forward, but very significant other players in the UK. We are now partnered with both Kingfisher with their UK brands B&Q and Screwfix, and then the John Lewis partnership for both their John Lewis banner and their Waitrose banner. So that's the initial thing. That's the thing we announced just before Cannes a few weeks ago with you guys, and that's the thing we're now building upon. And I'm sure we'll come on to this, but we see this as a classic pilot, learn, adapt. Very much a sort of a modern product management kind of way of launching a business.
Yeah, and to take a step up, right? Because you mentioned that, it's like one of the challenges is brands, they see this fragmentation, right? They want to buy across a given market. They're talking to a dozen different retailers, running a dozen different campaigns. Then they're probably trying to pay somebody to bring those things together. It feels like the other. I kind of look at the world the way we want to see the world, like the way we want it to be, right? Like something like this, which is a retailer-led network alliance. I think the other outcome is like, a Google or a Trade Desk or somebody says, we're going to be the aggregator. And then the value is going to some tech provider, which is kind of what happened to publishers and, previously, right?
Exactly. And we've both been through enough businesses to see change happens, right? So it's interesting. Very often in the first conversations we're having, people are saying, well, that's not how it works in the industry. Well, yeah, but if you go back to when programmatic started, programmatic was new and everybody's roles changed, agencies changed, and it really enabled those big tech players to begin to accelerate. And of course, digital's a great medium to do that, and in many ways much easier. But the things that we can bring that maybe one of those tech players hasn't got is that link back to actual activity in store. The link back to, very often we've got all the loyalty data with the retailers that we're working with across the globe. And so I think we're in a race, James. I think it's just one of those moments where the industry's changed. You're seeing Amazon doing its work with Macy's, or they announced, in the UK, they'll work with Asda. So they're trying to bring the real concrete world of retailing into their stack and their single way. And actually all we're really trying to do is go the other way and give retailers an alternative to being, if you like, kind of competed out a little bit by the big tech players. And I think if we work together, and that's why we've called it the Dunnhumby Network Alliance, is it's definitely a way of working together rather than competing with each other. And that's the spirit. It's kind of, if we get together, we'll have something that's more powerful than other players in the industry, and hopefully then makes sense for the advertisers to invest both shopper and brand budgets in time, as we kind of are able to offer more audience and inventory through the platform.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too, is going to the the shopper versus kind of brand or performance dollars, right? Because I think that's something retail media is struggling with today. If you talk to a lot of retailers, they've done a good job of capturing kind of all the shopper dollars they're going to get, and maybe they can get a little bit more here and there. They can do new offerings. They can, go duke it out on their next JBP to get a little more money here or there. But the question is, how do you get the performance dollars that are going to Meta or going to Google or going, or the brand dollars that are going to TV, right? And I think like that's the other big opportunity here, right? Is like that can the retailers get budget they're not even getting today?
So this isn't very modest if you're a retailer, but actually this is about how do we put the retailer at the center of the entire media industry, and I think that's not a goal necessarily in doing this, but it's absolutely a better way, I think, to think about why you would, as a retailer, think about working with somebody who you traditionally compete with on a basket of goods type, weekly shop. But equally, it's a really good way of challenging yourself to think about what's the journey your customer has taken to get into your store. What's inspired them around a product? Have they seen a new variant or flavor? Have they seen a digital out-of-home board on the way driving to your store? Or has something inspired them on, their TV station that's making them think about their weekly digital online shop? And I think that's been fascinating. We've had some really interesting conversations with both grocery retailers and fuel retailers about new journeys that the Dunnhumby Network Alliance could enable them to think about that they couldn't have done before. So the first iteration, and as I said, we're trying to do this with you as our partner in a way of test and learn and see what really bites. But we are also now talking to inventory partners and audience partners about how we might build this next stage, which is to truly enhance the audiences that are available and to truly be able to offer for brands some of those abilities to create much further up in their campaign. And I think this is the second inflection point. If you go and talk to any of the big CPG companies, their revolution that's going on in their business is they are no longer thinking, or most of them are beginning to push together. They're thinking on traditional brand budgets and shopper budgets. So they're changing. Those dollars will flow to whoever has adapted and changed in that world as well. And I know, James, you and I often have a debate or some good conversation around things like connected store and how important some of those traditional cardboard journeys or leaflet journeys or sampling journeys are as a differentiator when we talk to brands. All of those things are important in creating consideration for purchase and education and inspiration. So I think it changes. It's incredibly exciting for any of our people we're talking to at the moment. They get it. It's okay, I understand the risk, but that shift is phenomenal if we can pull half of it off in the next couple of years.
Well, I think it's what's so fascinating about it too is, coming from the, publishing world, that I was just kind of talking about, like the publishers just didn't have any power to do this, right? So it's kind of like, what's different, right? And we've seen the kind of, publishers have tried to build their alliances or tried to build, I won't name names, right? But it's like, they try to go and do that. But at the end of the day, you can find a 300 by 250 banner anywhere on the internet, right? Like, and you can buy it from people who aren't even, they're not even a UK publisher, but they can target people in the UK. You can reach them on Meta. You can, there was always like an abundance of that. Whereas I think retailers always have this unique power in the industry. It's like, you're going to Tesco and buying that food, that 12 pack of Diet Coke. You're going to John Lewis and buying a TV. You're going, it's like you're like, they control that last step. And so there's actually, I think that's what kind of gives them the opportunity to own this more than the kind of publishers and people like that beforehand.
I think that's right. And, when we talk to John Lewis and Waitrose, one's a grocery retailer, one's a sort of a great general store in the UK, a department store, probably they would prefer. And so they've got everything from TVs to sell to carpets to, homewares and clothing, etc. So their relationship with their brands is beginning to change as well, because those brands have had to look out into all of these alternative ways of creating consideration. And a lot of those traditional shopping journeys are morphing. And as you said, these alliances that maybe have pulled together certain groups of inventory has often been through survival, right? So you've just seen in the UK, ITV and Sky merging. If I go back to 20 years ago in my career, the very thought of the TV companies working together versus competing is kind of would have been a complete anathema. And a lot of our advertising journeys, started with the 3-minute slot. And I remember making TV ads as a very young man. Like, you would do the 1-minute cut as your real luxury one, and then the 30 and the 10, but they were there to create the inspiration. Now, when we think about why ITV and Sky and Channel 4 are all thinking about how to work together, they've got to collectively be able to do that at the right time in a much more contextual way than they ever used to have to do. And of course, there's a role for it. It's still a massively important medium, but it's part of a journey. And I think, to your point, this isn't just about retailers rising up and going, "Hey, great, we've got this power." That was always our unique. But now we actually have technology in stores. We have the ability to think about the journey to the stores. And I think it can be much more centralized around real customer need. And I think that's the shift for me. That's what I'd really like. If we get this right, I'll be incredibly proud that we've been able to deliver some simplification for the industry and customers and advertisers really. And I think we'll know if we get it right, because we'll start to see dollars flowing, because those big advertisers know what they're doing, right? They've spent the last 70 years of their being really kind of trying to measure marketing, and there's many quotes about that. So I think between us, James, we may have a real shot at creating a different paradigm for media here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because it is kind of bringing I think retailers have always had the, great audience, right? Audience data, great point of sale opportunity, in-store opportunity. But a lot of times the thing that's lacking is like the scale, right? And like, how do you just, obviously Tesco has like massive scale, but it could be more, right? I don't know the percentage of people in the UK that Tesco reaches, but there's a percentage they don't. And, if you compare to like a Meta, right? But if you start to say, okay, if you have the scale of a Meta, but you have the data and audience and attribution of a retailer, right? That's what's really compelling to us about it.
Yeah, and it's the depth of that information as well. You think whether somebody's walking today into a Waitrose or a Tesco and buying a can of Coke, at the moment nobody knows that same person is even doing that. So there's also a whole set of behavioral science that we're interested in at Dunnhumby on actually, like, it's probably a perfectly legitimate journey. You might be doing one of those because it's next door to your work or on your way home, or all of these habits and things are largely hidden at the moment, and that some of those patterns are things that I think we'll be able to bring unique media insight and performance data to as well. And I think it's been interesting talking to some of those big CPG brands. This is a very well-known problem for them. We were at MadFest here a few weeks ago and had a very good, I'll leave the CPG brand nameless, but they were absolutely fascinated that the thing that they are defining as one of their problem statements, somebody is now trying to tackle it and defragment things like inventory formats, and as well as thinking about how we would create those attribution models. There's a long way to go. Like, we've got to unpick a lot of behavioral constructs that have been in our industry from the year dot. But there's definitely an identified need that is being backed up by the people in those consumer goods companies that hold most of the dollars. Now, it's not just there. So, I know Kevel works in the US with some other homewares retailers and Home Depot and people like that. What we're finding in our work with B&Q is their journeys are quite different. They've got a lot more own brand. We've got to figure out what that means in terms of advertising, whether it's their own advertising to push their own brand, or whether it is certain different categories of product where perhaps advertising has not been able to play such a big part in their overall promotional plan. And so I think some of those journeys are going to be fascinating. The fuel retailer I was talking to, they've now got, it takes 20 to 30 minutes, even on a fast charge for an EV, right?
Yeah.
With a big screen in front of you. Okay, well, that nobody's really cracked that at all.
And a convenience store usually attached, right? And we did this recently. We did like a pretty long drive with an EV, and you end up charging for 20 minutes, and there's a store there, and you're like, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to buy a Coke and some chips and look around, and it's like, it's kind of changing. I think that's a very underserved market. But I like your can of Coke point is really great, because you just keep extending that, right? It's kind of like, you're in the office, Waitrose is next door, you get your can of Coke there, you're on your drive home, you stop at a to recharge, and you buy a can of Coke there, and then in your suburban home you're going to Tesco for all your shopping, and you're going to buy a 12-pack of Coke there. But today, all very disconnected. And I think you mentioned a little bit like the measurement piece, I think is a huge part of this, right? Like how much of when you're if you're using Tesco data to buy a campaign offsite, right? Like, but then the person's buying it at Waitrose, like, that's totally lost, right? Unless there's some other some of these other measurement companies that use lots of different ways to try to figure it out. But, this would actually be deterministic. Could actually say, oh no, this person,
That's right.
they saw that ad for that, that new snack, and they bought it at Waitrose, even though you bought it with, you're using, looking at more Tesco data, right?
Yeah, you have, of course, James, picked the hardest question, one of the hardest cases there. So
we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out.
We can do that over dinner one night and figure it out. But the we're really excited, and I guess the one thing we haven't talked about that I think is important is what we're doing together is trying to build this capability, and we're coming UK first because obviously our parent is Tesco and they sponsored it, and we've obviously got some great partners, and we'll use this as our test bed. We have grocers in the US in particular are beginning to find that unless they're one of the really big players, it's very hard to get the attention of the CPGs in the right way. So we would absolutely think there's a really strong market for 2, 3, 4, 5 retailers, probably mid-sized, but they're very decent sized in the US anyway, having lived there. So I think that's really fascinating. We've got an opportunity in 2 European countries already that's come up. We have a client down in Australasia who's interested. We had another client yesterday out in the Middle East who've expressed an interest as well. So the capability we are building to travel with, the model of anchoring it with one retailer, I think, is probably right. But then you can build around that, and it has to be like-minded people that genuinely can see the threat and the opportunity of what this could bring. And then the other bit I just wanted to mention was the different vertical markets. We've touched upon in one of those examples, kind of homewares, DIY. I think we believe that there is a real scope for this to go across health and beauty, to go across some of the wines and spirits markets, to think about more homeware stuff, luxury goods, clothing. We're talking to 2 or 3 people very early at the moment about how that might work in a and I think each sector is slightly different, but the capability and the platform, because we're building it as a platform, actually all of these things can coexist. And as long as we get the levers of right for each of the businesses that wants to join, then they can, of course, then have the ability to say yes or no, or I need this or I don't need that. So the beauty, I've inherited many businesses in my career where I haven't had fresh tech to sort of deal with. The beauty of this is we are, of course, at relative ground zero and building on top of the Kevel ad stack and to the side of it. And I think that's enabling us to think very freshly and not have to be as encumbered by perhaps the traditional ways of doing it. So so I think those are all really exciting for me. And in our future, we've got to get this first phase right. But
I think it's interesting that there's different opportunities, because we always talk about when we look at who do we want to work with from like a Kevel perspective, we think about where do you stand in the market, right? And it's like, and brands tend to kind of look at, okay, they're going to work with the top end in a market. And it doesn't seem to change that much. Like, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 6, but it's in that range. And so it's like in the US, it's like, okay, if you're a CPG, it's like, well, you got to work with Amazon, Walmart, and then you're like Albertsons, Kroger, and then maybe you get like one more in there, and then, but you think about it, you have these really big regional grocers, like you said, right? That, from a European standpoint are huge. From a US standpoint, they're 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 in the category. And so they're going to get kind of forgotten. I think that's like definitely one use case. But I think the interesting thing with the UK use case too is like it wasn't going to go in and saying, okay, how do we aggregate all the like grocers, right? It's actually like this cross category piece. I think it's really interesting because I think that's where it's like the same people are shopping, right? Somebody who's redoing their house, right, is going to B&Q or Screwfix, right, and they're buying sinks or things like this, right? But then they're also going to John Lewis and they're buying a new carpet and a new couch or something, and then they're going to Tesco and they're buying a whole set of new whatever, right? Like all these sort of things. And it's like that, being able to own like that cross retailer journey is really interesting. where I think there's
Yeah.
like, when we think about the aggregator, there are these different use cases of like the kind of cross category versus, depth of category, right? I think you can kind of go in you could go in both directions.
Yeah. And if I throw in I've lived in the US, as you know, and in Asia for a good period of time. So there's many different models. And I think we've seen a few already coming out. And if I think about what you just talked about in that homewares example, the immediate thing that I'm trying to get done here is I'm talking to one of the property portals. If we can get somebody who wants to get help work with both the audience and the signal that is somebody's bought or sold a house, that is so rich in terms of, like you bought an extra bedroom, it's very easy to start to create well, you've likely had a child or you're downsizing or whatever the journey is, right? That you think about any time you've ever moved house in your life, whether you were a student or whatever, there is a shopping list of stuff that you need like for the next 2 months, which is phenomenally large. So we're thinking about that as a way of really trying to anchor around a really strong use case. That's one good example. Or when we think about then the timing of where you would also be on some of those journeys, it's quite interesting. So I think there's lots of new exciting things that can come from it. And I'm talking the portal I've just had. It's a very initial conversation, so I'll leave them nameless. But there's no reason why, if we think about that US example as well, like somebody like Zillow or one of the big portals that would be a really great partner. They've got their own retail media businesses anyway. They're used to dealing with some of this, but they've got both audience signal, inventory. It's almost the perfect partner to come in alongside and start to really collaborate on creating journeys that are genuinely useful for a consumer. So if I've moved house, I would actually quite like it, instead of 35 leaflets through my door saying I'll come and clean your gutters or I'll do X or Y. I really like it if somebody sent me here's a really great set of offers for you around the things you are likely to want or need, and linking in perhaps with some of the loyalty programs that I'm already part of. In this, for the UK, that would be both Tesco and B&Q and John Lewis and Waitrose. But all of that stuff, all of the data that comes out of both that loyalty data, the shop, and the probabilistic stuff is I think it's quite exciting when we start thinking about pulling other partners in this way. And a lot of those other businesses have got inventory-based media businesses now that they don't necessarily get to think in as wide a way as we do as a grocer, where we've got so many products and so many categories to play with. They sort of end up really with the same 3 or 4 people, saying, well, I'm an electrician, I could do a local advert or whatever.
Yeah. And I think the other interesting constituency here, and I know you have some history in the kind of fintech banking space, right? Is like, as we look at all these banks and airlines, and we're working with people like PayPal and SaaS, and it's like they have a wealth of data, and they have a captive. You're sitting there on a seat back. But then I think there's this big opportunity of, okay, well, how do we bring some of the data from the retailer into that, some of the attribution, some of the measurement? Like I think there's a big opportunity in bringing some of these commerce, not total retailers, into something like this, because it kind of gives them what they're missing, but they also have like that user in a captive moment that the retailer doesn't usually have, right? Like you're going in a retail, you're going through, you have a task, you're kind of on a path, whereas I think you're sitting on a seat back, right? But I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and like how do we kind of extend it out to the commerce group?
We're aligned on that, as you know. But and it triggers one other thought, which is, it's interesting. You can think about big markets like the UK or the US, but when you think about medium-sized conglomerations of markets, and I did run a banking job out for 15 markets in Asia, so I'll use that as the example. But all of those countries are very different. But when you are trying to reach all of those consumers, there's a lot of similarities. So getting together even across multiple countries, where it would enable a brand to run its advertising or promotion across several countries and retailers, is probably a use case we haven't got to yet. but I could absolutely see how it would make sense for some of those brand groups to be able to do that. So yes, kind of the future's bright, I think, but we've got a lot of hard work to do on getting the technology and platform right, and figuring out how to do some really hard stuff on audiences. But yeah, I mean, what a great problem for us to be working on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you mentioned kind of the cross country thing. I think about this a lot when I go to our CR team in Copenhagen, I always fly SAS there, right? They're a customer of ours.
Yeah.
But, I'm an American flying SAS to Copenhagen. It's like you showing me an ad for a Copenhagen retailer or something in Danish, right? Doesn't make sense. Right. And it's how do you think about, extending that audience and saying, oh, well, actually, there's a retailer in the US who has the data, who knows who I am, who could show me a very targeted ad. Right. So I think there's even this kind of global aspect to some of this that, I don't think we've figured out how to do all of that yet. But I think these, getting these retailers, these groups working together unlocks a lot of that.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, this is last thing I'll ask you real quick is if you're a retailer listening to this, think this is really interesting, who should they reach out to? Should they reach out to you?
Me.
Else? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, just find me. We'd love to engage. We are absolutely thinking, my job's to make sure we're slightly over the horizon each time, and so we're in deep planning for end of this year and next year. I'm spending time in the US later this year anyway. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. I'm very happy to just have an open discussion about whether it's the right thing or not. It's less of a sell and more of a, do you believe in the philosophy of where the market may go? And if you do, then it's worth considering, and the changes you probably need to make to your business as well. So
awesome. Well, Andrew, thank you for coming on.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it. See you soon.
See you soon. Thanks for tuning in to Unlocking Retail Media. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share this show with your network. We'll be back soon with more insights to help you navigate the future of retail media. See you next time.